He laughed. That was the part that would stay with her longest. Not the gun, not the flashlight aimed directly into her eyes, not the contempt dripping from his voice like something that had been fermenting inside him for years. It was the laugh, the specific quality of it, loose and satisfied, the sound of a man who believed in his very marrow that he had already won. Deputy Walt Greer of the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department stood on the shoulder of State Road 9 in rural Alabama on a Thursday evening in August, his service weapon pointed at the face of the woman in the rental sedan, and he was laughing at the gold shield she had just shown him. An FBI badge, he said, shaking his head slowly, the way a man does when someone has tried to pull a trick he has seen 100 times before. Sure. Where'd you buy that, sweetheart? Online. They sell all kinds of things online these days. He actually chuckled after that, a private self-appreciating chuckle. He looked back toward his patrol cruiser, as though he might share the joke with someone, found his rookie partner, standing 20 yards back, looking at the ground, and redirected his amusement inward. The woman in the car did not react to the laugh. She sat perfectly still behind the wheel. Her hands visible, her breathing measured, her eyes, level and calm, in a way that should have told him everything he needed to know, and somehow told him nothing at all. Her name was Dr. Camille Okafor. She was 38 years old, the daughter of a retired schoolteacher from Grayford, Alabama, and a graduate of Howard University and the FBI Academy at Quantico, Virginia. For 11 years, she had worked in the Behavioral Analysis Unit, the division of the FBI that hunted the people most other investigators did not know how to find. She had sat across interrogation tables from men who had done things that would make most people lose their capacity for sleep. She had profiled killers in 4 countries. She had testified before federal grand juries, addressed joint intelligence briefings, and written the behavioral assessment that led to the arrest of a man who had evaded law enforcement for 9 years. She knew what a real gun looked like. She knew what a real threat looked like. And she knew with the absolute measured certainty of a woman who had spent her entire professional life studying human behavior at its most dangerous, exactly what Deputy Walt Greer was. What he did not know, what he could not process, because to process it would require him to become a fundamentally different person than the one he had spent 17 years carefully constructing, was that his laugh was not the sound of victory. It was the sound of a door closing behind him. In the next few minutes, Camille Okafor would press a button on the steering column of her rental car. That button would connect a Bluetooth call that would end Greer's career, initiate a federal investigation that would dismantle a county law enforcement department down to its rotten foundation, and ultimately free a 22-year-old man currently sitting in a state prison for a crime he did not commit. All of that was about to happen because Walt Greer had laughed at a gold shield on a dark Alabama highway and called it a prop. Stay with this story, because what came next was a reckoning 17 years in the making, and it moved with the quiet, inevitable precision of everything that has been earned. 2 hours earlier, the evening was beautiful. Camille had noticed it the way she noticed everything. With attention, she could not quite turn off, even when she tried a professional reflex that had become so integrated into her personality, she was no longer sure where the training ended and the person began. The light was doing something specific to the pines along State Road 9, catching the tops of them and turning them the color of copper wire, and the shadows they threw across the 2-lane road had a particular quality that belonged only to August in Alabama, only to this particular latitude, only to evenings like this one, when the heat was finally beginning to relent and the air coming through the cracked window smelled like honeysuckle and warm red clay. She had driven this road 100 times growing up. She knew the curve at mile marker 18 where a deer had stepped out in front of her mother's station wagon when Camille was 9 years old, and how Ruth Okafor had handled the moment with the same quiet competence she brought to everything, a careful deceleration. No panic, one hand extended across Camille's chest, as though a seatbelt were not sufficient. She knew the stretch near the old cotton gin that had been converted into a feed store, and then into nothing in particular, a building that simply existed as a landmark, now, its purpose having outlasted everyone's memory of it. She knew the particular way the radio reception faded and returned along this stretch, the gospel station from Grayford, that her mother kept on every Sunday morning, and which Camille had been quietly grateful for on this particular drive, not because she was especially religious, but because there was something grounding about a woman's voice singing about endurance on a Thursday evening in August when you were tired in a way that a week of sleep would not fully fix. She was driving a rented Ford Fusion navy blue, picked up at the Birmingham airport 3 hours ago, after a flight from Dulles that had been delayed 40 minutes and then made up most of the time in the air. Her briefcase was on the passenger seat. Her service weapon, the Sig Sauer P226 she had carried for 11 years, was holstered on her right hip, partially covered by the dark linen blazer she had not bothered to change out of after the flight. Her go bag was in the trunk. She had not planned for this to be anything other than a personal trip. That was the thing she would reflect on later in the days and weeks after she had been completely deliberately, intentionally off duty. Ruth Okafor had undergone hip replacement surgery 6 weeks prior. She was 71 years old, a retired middle school English teacher who had spent 34 years trying to make 12-year-olds care about the distinction between a metaphor and a simile, and who had succeeded more often than the national statistics for teacher burnout would suggest was reasonable. She was fierce and warm, and entirely unwilling to admit that the recovery from her surgery was harder than she had anticipated, which Camille knew from the weekly phone calls, where Ruth's voice was slightly tighter than usual, and she changed the subject whenever Camille asked about her physical therapy. Camille had promised 2 weeks. She had told her unit chief she was using accumulated leave 3 weeks' worth, which she had been carrying for over a year, because she was the kind of person who deferred her own needs in favor of whatever case was currently demanding everything she had. She had handed off her active casework to her partner, told him to call only if something was genuinely on fire, and boarded a plane to Alabama with the specific intention of being, for 2 weeks, nothing more complicated than a daughter. She was not an FBI agent on this drive. She was not a profiler or an analyst or a behavioral expert. She was Camille driving home on a familiar road in the late summer light, mentally reviewing what her mother needed from the grocery store in Grayford Stoneground. Grits, from the specific brand Ruth used the sweet tea she made from scratch rather than from a mix, pecans for the pie she had apparently decided to bake despite her physical therapist's guidance about extended standing and not thinking about anything more professionally taxing than that. Her speed was exactly at the posted limit, which was 50 miles per hour on this stretch of road. She had checked it almost unconsciously when she got onto State Road 9, the habit of 20 years of driving in a profession where appearing in any way negligent in any way at any time was a liability she did not permit herself. Her registration was in order, her headlights were on, her insurance card was in the glove compartment beside the rental agreement. She had done a full walk-around of the vehicle at the rental agency in Birmingham before accepting the keys, checking the lights, the tire condition, the body for existing damage, and everything had been functioning correctly. There was one small thought, barely a footnote, that moved through her mind somewhere around mile marker 26. A file that had been sitting in the BAU's shared drive for 6 weeks, flagged by a junior analyst named Torres, who had been working on a pattern recognition project involving civil rights complaints from rural jurisdictions in 3 southeastern states. Caldwell County, Alabama, had appeared in that file. The complaint density civil rights allegations per capita, cross-referenced against case dispositions, was an outlier. More complaints than surrounding counties, far fewer that had ever been escalated to the state attorney general or the DOJ. Torres had flagged it. Camille had been meaning to read it in full. She had gotten through approximately 2/3 of it before a more urgent case had pulled her attention in another direction, and she had bookmarked it with the intention of returning. She had not yet returned. She made a mental note to do so after her 2 weeks with Ruth. She turned the gospel station up slightly as the singer moved into the bridge of something that sounded like it had been written for exactly this kind of evening, on exactly this kind of road, and she let herself simply drive. 37 seconds later, the world behind her erupted in red and blue. Her heart did not jump. That was the first thing, the one she would describe later in her official statement with clinical precision, and which she would never fully explain to anyone who had not spent years training for the specific experience of suddenly dangerous situations. Her heart did not jump because her nervous system had been conditioned through repetition and practice and actual experience to respond to the appearance of threat not with panic, but with a kind of focused settling. Like water heated to the precise temperature where it becomes still rather than turbulent. She checked her speedometer first, 49 miles per hour. She had not drifted. She checked her mirrors, one patrol car lights active, riding her bumper more aggressively than any traffic stop required. The lights cycling through their strobing pattern without the siren, which meant this was meant to be sudden and disorienting, but not officially urgent. She checked the road ahead, no other vehicles visible, no intersections for the next half mile. She signaled. She moved her right foot from the accelerator to the brake, with practiced economy bringing the car's speed down gradually rather than abruptly. She guided the Fusion onto the gravel shoulder, near a stand of tall pines that the headlights of the patrol car behind her were already washing in blue and red. She shifted into park. She cut the engine. She reached up and switched on the interior dome light. She placed both hands on the top of the steering wheel, fingers spread wide apart and clearly visible. These were the things you did, the things that had been protocol for a reason. The steps that communicated without words to an approaching officer that the person in this vehicle was not a threat. She had done them smoothly and immediately, without hesitation. It had taken her approximately 12 seconds from the moment the lights appeared to the moment her hands were on the wheel. She knew exactly what she looked like from the patrol car's dash cam, a cooperative driver who had pulled over cleanly and assumed the safest possible posture. She watched the cruiser in her side mirror as it rolled to a stop behind her. The passenger side positioned to allow the officer to exit quickly into the space between the vehicles. The door opened. A figure emerged. He was built in a particular way that she cataloged in the first second, without consciously deciding to stocky across the shoulder as thick through the neck. The kind of physical density that sometimes comes from genuine conditioning and sometimes comes from the gradual accumulation of a sedentary life spent in a vehicle supplemented by irregular habits and a belief that authority was its own kind of exercise. He was white somewhere in his middle 40s, a buzz cut going to gray at the temples, his deputy's uniform neat but not pressed with any particular care. His name tag was visible even at this distance in her mirror, W. Greer. He approached along the passenger side of the Fusion rather than the driver's side. This was not unusual. It was in fact a standard intimidation tactic, documented in enough training literature that Camille had read formal analyses of it, designed to force the driver to turn their body away from the natural direction, to crane their neck, to feel physically off balance in relation to the officer's approach. It communicated at a nonverbal level that the officer intended to control the geometry of this interaction. Before a single word was spoken, she remained perfectly still. Greer stopped at the passenger window and tapped on it with one thick knuckle, not a knock more of an assertion. She lowered it smoothly. The August air that came in was thick with the smell of warm clay and pine resin, and underneath that, the faint ghost of something damp and complicated that was just the specific smell of this part of Alabama. In this part of summer, the smell she had grown up with, the smell that meant home. Greer's flashlight came on and went directly into her eyes. He held it there a second longer than any legitimate purpose required. "Evening, ma'am," he said. His voice was a low, thick drawl, the kind that might have sounded friendly to someone who had not spent 11 years learning to hear what was underneath sound. There was no warmth in it. It was the word evening used as a statement of position rather than a greeting. "Good evening," Officer Camille replied. Her voice was even and quiet, calibrated to signal neither deference nor aggression. She had learned long ago that the most useful tone in a tense situation was simply neutral, not warm enough to seem like you were trying to manage someone, not cool enough to seem like a challenge. "Was I speeding?" Greer did not answer the question. He moved the flashlight from her face to a slow sweep of the car's interior, the briefcase on the passenger seat, the center console, the back seat, the floor. His gaze returned to her face with the deliberate pace of someone who was not in any particular hurry and wanted her to know it. "License and registration," he said. Not a question, not phrased as a request, just the words in the tone of someone who issued orders for a living and expected the world to arrange itself accordingly. "My wallet is in my purse on the passenger floor," Camille said, moving nothing yet. The rental agreement is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now, slowly starting with the purse. She maintained eye contact with him throughout this narration, watching his face cataloging his response. He grunted. Affirmative enough. His hand had drifted to rest casually on the butt of his holstered service weapon during the 6 seconds it took her to retrieve the documents, which she noted. She moved with the kind of deliberate slowness that communicates awareness of the gravity of the situation, not nervousness, which looks like guilt, but care, which looks like professionalism. She handed over the license and rental agreement. He took them, looked at the license. His eyes moved to her Virginia address, and something in his expression changed. A small compression around the corners of his mouth, a barely perceptible adjustment in his posture. "You're a long way from home," he said. The subtext was not subtle. "You don't belong here." It was the kind of statement that existed in a specific borderland between conversation and threat, deniable enough to be unprovable, clear enough to be unmistakable. Visiting family. Camille said simply. She gave him nothing extra. Profilers learn early that unnecessary information is a gift you give to someone who may intend to use it against you. He took his time with the documents, his flashlight playing over them in a way that communicated searching rather than reading, looking for something that would justify what he had already decided. After a full minute, which is a very long time to look at a valid driver's license and a rental agreement, he handed them back. "The reason I pulled you over," he said, "is your right rear tail light is out." Camille allowed herself one small contained reaction, a slight knit of her eyebrows, controlled and real. "Officer, I did a complete vehicle check before I left the rental agency in Birmingham. I checked all the lights specifically. They were functioning." The flicker that crossed Greer's face was rapid, but she caught it. Irritation, not at the information, but at being questioned, at having his stated reason challenged by someone who was not supposed to be in a position to challenge it. He was not used to that. The irritation told her something important about how often it happened. "Well, it's out now," he said. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." And there it was, the step that moved this from a pretextual stop into something else entirely. Camille did not move to open the door. She understood the legal landscape of this moment precisely. A broken taillight, even a genuinely broken one, which this was not, did not provide probable cause to require a driver to exit their vehicle. The Supreme Court had held otherwise at various junctures in the specific context of officer safety concerns, but those holdings had parameters, and none of those parameters applied to this situation. He had already had her license and registration. She had not made any threatening movement or statement. The road was dark and rural, but darkness and rurality were not threat indicators. An exit order in this context was an escalation. It was the move of someone who wanted physical control over a situation in which they did not yet have it, and who was willing to manufacture a legal justification for that control after the fact. She had read the case files. She knew how these reports were written. She knew what happened to the people who got out of the car when there was no legal basis for the order, because they happened to be the kind of people for whom the costs of refusal often felt unbearable. "With all due respect, officer," she said, keeping her voice at the same measured register she had maintained throughout. "I'd like to understand why I need to exit my vehicle for an alleged taillight issue. My license is valid, the registration is in order. You can write the citation, and I'll be on my way." She paused precisely one beat. "Or, I'm happy to remain here while you verify anything further." Greer's face underwent a change, the professional veneer thin as it had been dropped. What was underneath was not rage exactly, but something adjacent to it, the particular emotion of a man who has been accustomed to a specific kind of compliance and encountered unexpectedly its absence. "Because I told you to," he said. His voice was lower now, flatter, the drawl stripped of its casual quality and replaced with something harder. "Now, step out of the car or I'll pull you out." This was the crossroads that Camille had identified the moment she pulled onto the shoulder. She had known it was coming. She had been watching the indicators accumulate, the passenger side approach, the prolonged document inspection, the pretextual taillight explanation, and she had been making calculations on a dark road with no witnesses, with a deputy who had already telegraphed his intentions clearly enough for a trained observer to read them. Her rights were a theoretical construct rather than a practical protection. But she was not just any citizen on a dark road. She was a federal officer who had sworn an oath to the Constitution she was being asked to surrender. She was a professional who spent her working life understanding exactly how men like this operated and what it cost the people who encountered them when no one pushed back. And she was a behavioral analyst who had just completed a very rapid and very accurate assessment of who she was dealing with. She made her decision. "Officer Greer," she said, and the quality of her voice changed, not louder, not harsh, but carrying a new weight, a new calibration. The voice she used when she wanted someone to hear not just what she was saying, but what was underneath it. "I am a federal officer. My credentials are in my briefcase on the passenger seat. My service weapon is holstered on my right hip, under my jacket." She kept her hands completely visible. "I am identifying myself to you as a professional courtesy before we go any further, and I'm asking you to call your supervisor to the scene." She watched his face with the attention of someone for whom faces were text. What she saw was a rapid, sequential set of responses that told her a great deal. First, surprise, brief, and genuine. Second, something that might have been the beginning of recalibration, a moment where his brain was processing the new information and its implications. Third, and this was the one that mattered, the one that determined everything that came next, the recalibration failed. His ego asserted itself over his judgment. The surprise collapsed into skepticism, and the skepticism hardened into contempt, because the alternative, accepting that the woman in this car was exactly what she said she was, would have required him to revise a fundamental assumption that his entire sense of himself was built on. His hand unsnapped the retention strap on his holster. "Federal officer," he said, and the mockery in it was specific and layered. It was not the mockery of a man who has heard a lot of false claims. It was the mockery of a man who had already decided at a level below conscious thought that a black woman driving a rental car in Caldwell County, Alabama, on a Thursday evening could not possibly be anything that required him to adjust his behavior. The claim was not being evaluated. It was being dismissed on arrival. Camille kept her hands visible and still. "My jacket is unbuttoned. I'm going to use my left hand, my non-dominant hand, to move the lapel aside so you can see both the weapon and my credentials. Nothing else. Is that acceptable?" He didn't answer, but he nodded. One short, curt motion. She moved her left hand to her blazer lapel with an economy of movement that was almost painful in its deliberateness. She peeled it back. The gold shield caught the flashlight, the way gold always does, not dully, not gradually, but all at once, a sudden, sharp claim of light. The FBI seal. The eagle with its wings spread. The badge number etched cleanly into the metal. And beside it, the butt of the .226 holstered exactly as she had described. She held the lapel back and waited. Greer's flashlight beam landed on the badge. She watched his eyes. She watched the sequence of expressions, and she saw the moment that the evidence arrived in his mind and was rejected. Not processed and found lacking. Rejected, as though his mind had a bouncer at the door, and certain categories of information simply were not admitted. "You've got to be kidding me," he said slowly, and a sound came out of him that was technically a laugh, but which was also something else. It was loud. It was pushed out with a kind of forced quality, as though volume could substitute for conviction. "An FBI badge." He shook his head. "Where'd you buy that, sweetheart? Online?" "They sell all kinds of things online these days." "Nice try," he said, sweetheart, with a particular deliberateness, slowly so she couldn't miss it. Weighted with 17 years of a specific kind of authority. And what that authority had taught him, he was permitted to say to the people he stopped on dark roads. And then he said something else, quieter, almost to himself, but audible through the open window, in the stillness of the August evening. He said real FBI doesn't drive fusions to visit their mama in Grayford on a Thursday. He said it with a small, satisfied smile. He said it like a man displaying a piece of private knowledge he was proud of. He said it like a man who had never once in 17 years been required to reconsider any of his assumptions about who belonged where and who deserved what. That sentence, those exact words in that exact tone, would be read back to him by the federal judge at his sentencing 9 months later. Camille was making a note of it as he spoke. She let the lapel fall back. She placed her left hand on the wheel. "Officer Greer," she said, and her voice was different now. Not harder, she did not do harder. It was not a register she found useful, but stripped of everything that was not information. Badge number 472. My name is Special Agent Dr. Camille Okafor, Behavioral Analysis Unit Quantico. The weapon I'm carrying is a federally issued Sig Sauer P226. You are currently committing a felony. You have approximately 30 seconds to lower your weapon and call your supervisor before I treat this as an act of aggression against a federal officer in the line of duty. He drew his Glock and aimed it at her face. In the peripheral field that her training had expanded over years of work, she registered Cody Pruitt, the young deputy, who had been hanging back by the patrol car throughout all of this hat brim, low avoiding eye contact, take a single involuntary step backward. Not forward, backward. Greer's finger was near the trigger. His hand was steady in the way that hands are steady when adrenaline has locked the muscles, which is a different kind of steady than calm, and she could tell the difference. Hands on the wheel, he said. Both of them. Now, the world had narrowed to the dimensions of this specific moment on this specific road. The cricket sound had not stopped, but it was very far away. The pine smell was still there, but abstract, registered by some part of her mind that was not currently in charge. The part that was in charge was doing something very quiet with her right thumb. Her hands were on the wheel, visible, compliant. And Walt Greer standing outside the passenger window of a rental Ford Fusion on State Road 9 in Caldwell County, Alabama, with his service weapon pointed at the face of a Behavioral Analysis Unit agent, felt powerful. That was the part that mattered, that he genuinely felt it. He was not performing authority for an audience. There was no one here he needed to impress. Deputy Pruitt was 20 yards away and looking at his shoes. The road was empty in both directions, dark beyond the reach of the cruiser's lights. This was not theater. This was Walt Greer experiencing in his body and in something that passed for his soul, the sensation of complete control over a situation. He stepped back from the window, slightly keeping the weapon up, and allowed himself a private moment of assessment. The woman in the car was still calm. That continued to irritate him in a way he couldn't fully articulate, because people were supposed to be afraid and she wasn't performing afraid correctly. But her hands were on the wheel. She was not reaching for anything. The situation was in his assessment, completely under his management. He reached for his radio with his left hand, keeping the Glock steady in his right. "Dispatch. This is Unit 7. His voice was easy, conversational. The voice of a man narrating a slightly tedious situation from a position of complete comfort. Got a non-compliant black female driver on State Road 9-mile marker 31. Virginia plates on a rental. Subject is claiming to be a federal agent and showing what appears to be a counterfeit credential." He glanced toward the car, toward the woman inside it, and let a beat of amusement color his next words. "FBI." He said it with the same tone someone might use to report that a driver had claimed to be the King of England. "Going to need a transport unit and a tow. Subject is refusing to exit the vehicle." He clicked off. He looked at the car. At Camille, visible through the glass, hands on the wheel, eyes forward. "Federal agent," he said half to himself and shook his head one more time. He let a sound out somewhere between a sigh and a chuckle, the sound of a man who has been doing a job long enough to have encountered every variation of attempt and who finds the latest one mildly entertaining in its audacity. He moved slightly toward the rear of her car, maintaining his sightline through the window, and fished a pack of cigarettes from his breast pocket with his left hand. He lit one. He stood on the shoulder of State Road 9, and he smoked, and he watched the woman in the rental car, and he felt entirely, completely, irreversibly in control of this situation. 23 feet away, Cody Pruitt was staring at the gravel under his boots. He was 24 years old. He had been with the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department for 14 months. He had been partnered with Walt Greer for the last 6 of those months, and in 6 months he had learned a number of things about the way Walt Greer worked that he had not been able to unlearn and had not yet found a way to act on. He had learned about the taillight pretexts. He had learned about the cash that sometimes ended up in Greer's kit bag after searches that yielded no contraband. He had learned about the specific categories of drivers that Greer flagged on State Road 9 and other stretches of County Road out-of-state plates late at night. Demographics that Greer had never described with any clinical language, but which Pruitt understood through the accumulated weight of experience. He had learned all of these things, and he had said nothing to anyone because Walt Greer had been in Caldwell County for 17 years, and Greer's family had been in Caldwell County for 4 generations, and the sheriff had known Greer's father, and the things that had happened on the side of dark roads in Caldwell County had always somehow landed only on the people they happened to, rather than on the man who made them happen. He was looking at his boots because looking at the woman in the car made him feel something he did not know how to manage. Inside the car, Camille's right thumb found the voice command button on the steering column. She did not move her hands from the 10 and 2 position. She did not look down. She did not change her breathing pattern, or her facial expression, or the direction of her gaze, which remained fixed on the windshield ahead, the pine trees in the headlights, the particular texture of an Alabama highway at night. She located the button by the specific tactile memory of having driven this model of car twice before the Fusion had a distinctive ridge on that button, a slightly raised lip, and she had clocked it when she adjusted her driving position at the Birmingham airport. She pressed it once, firmly. A soft chime, barely audible, easily masked by the engine's idle, and the ambient night sounds signaled that the Bluetooth was live and connected to her phone. "Call Ray," she said. Quiet, toward the dashboard, under the sound of everything else. Greer, 8 feet away and finishing his cigarette, heard something. He frowned toward the car. "What did you say?" "Nothing, Officer," Camille said, level and calm eyes, forward hands exactly where they had been. He squinted at her, decided she had been talking to herself, looked away. Through the car's speakers, almost entirely covered by the engine sound and the ambient noise of the night, there was a distant ringing. Once. Twice. Special Agent in charge, Leonard Ray, picked up on the second ring. He was 61 years old, 26 years with the Bureau, a man whose voice had been shaped by a lifetime of speaking in rooms where the temperature of the conversation was determined entirely by how he chose to open his mouth. He was not groggy. He had not been asleep. He had been at his desk in the Atlanta field office doing what he almost always did at 10:43 on Thursday evenings, which was reading case files with a cup of bad coffee and the particular focused attention of someone who knew that preparation was the only real form of luck. He had not been asleep because his tablet had registered 4 minutes ago a silent alert from Agent Okafor's Bureau-issued cell phone. The alert was generated automatically by a feature that most agents never activated and which Camille had turned on 2 years ago after a situation in Memphis that she did not discuss in detail with anyone. It was a distress indicator triggered not by any action dramatic enough to draw attention, but by the specific pattern of an FBI phone that had been stationary on a roadside location for an extended period while its owner had not interacted with it, cross-referenced with the phone's GPS coordinates in a jurisdiction flagged for civil rights monitoring. SAC Ray had seen the alert. He had pulled up the coordinates on his mapping system. He had noted that Agent Okafor's phone placed her on State Road 9 in Caldwell County, Alabama, a county that appeared in a file he had reviewed 6 weeks ago, and which had generated a low-grade but persistent background concern in his professional mind. He had been about to call her when his phone rang. "Ray," he said. "Frank." Her voice was quiet, immediate, and calibrated, with the specific quality he had learned to recognize in 11 years of working with Camille Okafor as meaning, "I have a situation, and I need you to process what I'm about to say without wasting time on questions I don't have time to answer." She gave him everything in one continuous, unhurried delivery. Her location, State Road 9-mile marker 31, the County Caldwell. The officer Deputy W. Greer, Caldwell County Sheriff's Department. His badge number, which she had memorized from the name tag. The nature of the encounter service weapon, drawn and aimed at her credentials, presented and rejected refusal to acknowledge federal status. Her physical condition unharmed, hands-on wheel weapon holstered. She said all of this in the voice of someone filing a report, not in the voice of someone who was afraid, because she was not giving herself permission to be afraid yet. And she had learned long ago that the most important thing she could give the people who needed to help her was accurate information delivered in a way that allowed them to act on it immediately. Through the car speakers, her voice filled the fusion. Outside the passenger window, Greer had been raising his cigarette toward his mouth. He stopped. The sound that came out of the car speakers was not the voice of a boyfriend or a relative or a lawyer. It was the voice of a man who had spent a quarter-century in positions of authority and whose voice carried that history in its very timbre, certain, unhurried, and absolutely without any uncertainty about what it was about to do. The sound of it cut through the August air and landed on Walt Greer like something physical. Officer Greer, SAC. Ray's voice came through the fusion speaker system with the clarity of a command frequency. This is Special Agent in Charge Leonard Ray of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Atlanta Field Office. You are currently holding a federal officer at gunpoint. You have 10 seconds to holster your weapon and place your hands on the roof of your patrol vehicle. Failure to comply will be treated as an act of aggression against the United States government. Greer's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The cigarette fell from his fingers unsmoked and hit the gravel in a small shower of orange sparks. His face, which had been for the past 15 minutes performing a kind of lazy, satisfied confidence, underwent a transformation that Camille watched with the precision of a woman who had spent her career studying exactly this, the moment when a person's constructed identity collides with a reality they cannot accommodate. The color left his face, starting at the forehead and moving downward, a tide going out, leaving behind a gray-white surface that did not look healthy. His eyes moved to the car, to the speakers, to Camille, back to the speakers. His gun hand was shaking. 10 seconds, Ray said. He had begun counting. His voice did not change. It was the voice of someone for whom counting to 10 from a position of absolute authority was simply a thing that happened. At 7, something broke in Walt Greer. It was not a dramatic break. It did not announce itself. It was the kind of break that happens when a structure that has been under pressure for too long reaches a point that it simply cannot maintain. A choked sound escaped his throat. Not a sob, not a word, something more primitive than either, and his arm, which had been holding the Glock, with the locked muscle steadiness of adrenaline, lowered. The holster. His hand found it by muscle memory and returned the weapon with a clatter that was louder than it should have been because his hand was shaking. He stumbled backward from the car. 1 step. 2. His hands went up, both of them, freeing in the universal gesture of surrender. The gesture he had caused other people to make hundreds of times and which felt on his own body like something he did not have a word for. "Okay," he said. His voice was barely recognizable. "Okay, it's holstered." "Okay." Confirm, Agent Okafor, Ray said. "Weapon is holstered, SAC. Camille's voice was exactly as steady as it had been throughout. "Officer is moving away from my vehicle." "Good. Sheriff of Caldwell County. Earl Maddox is being contacted now. Atlanta Field Office is mobilizing. Do not engage further. Keep this line open." Outside the car, Walt Greer stood on the shoulder of State Road 9 with his back against his patrol cruiser, his face the color of old milk, his chest heaving with a breathing pattern that was no longer controlled by him. He was looking at the rental car, at the woman inside it. The look on his face was something that Camille, in 11 years of profiling, had seen before. It was the look of a man who has been running in a particular direction for a very long time and has just discovered all at once that the ground has ended. He had laughed 17 minutes ago at a gold shield. Now he understood what the shield represented, and the understanding was arriving all at once, the full weight of it, everything it meant and everything it was going to mean. And there was nowhere on this dark road for Walt Greer to put any of it. The headlights appeared from the direction of Grayford 3 minutes later. A Chevrolet Tahoe with the Caldwell County Sheriff's seal on the door, moving at a speed that communicated urgency while still being the speed of a man who was not racing towards something he wanted to reach. It pulled over behind Greer's cruiser with a careful, deliberate precision. The engine cut. A single figure stepped out. Sheriff Earl Maddox was 63 years old and looked it. Not in the way of someone who had been defeated by his age, but in the way of someone who had been worn by it, the wear of a man who had spent decades in a job that required him to be present at the worst moments in other people's lives, and who had over time accumulated the weight of all of it in his face and his bearing. and the specific quality of his walk, which was the walk of someone who had made peace with the fact that most things did not resolve cleanly. He was weathered rather than finished. His hair was fully white. His face was lined in the pattern of a man who had spent time outdoors in all kinds of weather. And his eyes beneath the brim of his hat were the color of weathered tin and carried in them a kind of quiet that was not peace but was adjacent to it. He took the scene in immediately and completely. The rental car on the shoulder, the woman inside it, hands visible, composed. His deputy standing against his own cruiser, 20 yards back, hands still half raised, faced the color of something that had been left in the sun too long. The air between all of these elements, which was charged with what had just happened and what it meant. Maddox had not been surprised to receive the call from SAC Ray. That was the thing he would think about later in the quiet hours of a long night. He had not been surprised. He had been bracing for a version of this call. Not this specific version, not this specific woman, not this specific night, but some call like it for a long time. The surprise he felt when the call came was not the surprise of the unexpected. It was the surprise of the thing you have been dreading finally arriving, which was a different emotion entirely, and one that had its own particular weight. He knew about Greer's complaints. Not from a file he had not spent time with the files, which was itself a failure he would have to live with, but from the specific social osmosis of a small department in a small county. The things that were known and not discussed, the pattern of incidents that people mentioned and then allowed to drift into silence because Walt Greer's father had coached half the county's Little League teams and Walt Greer's uncle had been on the county commission for 12 years, and the ecosystem of Caldwell County's institutional life had organized itself over time around the assumption that some things about Walt Greer were simply how things were. He walked to Camille's car first. He stopped a respectful distance from the window, not the aggressive proximity of Greer's approach, but the careful distance of someone establishing that they were not a threat. Through the car speakers, SAC Ray's voice. "Sheriff Maddox, this is SAC Ray, FBI Atlanta. Your deputy just held one of my agents at gunpoint. This situation is now a federal matter." Maddox closed his eyes for a single second. He let out a breath through his nose. Then he opened his eyes, and he looked at Deputy Walt Greer, still leaning against his cruiser. And what was in Maddox's expression was not shock or defensiveness or calculation. It was disappointment, the specific adult exhausted disappointment of a man who has known for a long time that something was going to break and had not done enough to prevent it, and who now had to stand in the wreckage of his own failure to act. "Understood," Sir Maddox said to the speakers. His voice was tight but steady. He turned to Greer. "Vance, get over here." Greer shuffled forward. He was walking with the gait of a man who had been recently drained of everything that had given him his particular way of moving through the world. The swagger was gone. What remained was something smaller and more fundamental, just a man in a uniform on a dark road with nowhere to go. "Your weapon," Maddox said, and held out his hand, flat. Palm up. Greer unholstered the Glock. His grip first, as protocol required. He placed it in the sheriff's hand. "Your cuffs," Maddox said. Greer's eyes went to him. A flash of something protest disbelief, the beginning of an appeal. "Sheriff Maddox, Your cuffs, Walt." With hands that were no longer steady, Greer unclipped the handcuffs from his duty belt and placed them in the sheriff's other hand. Maddox looked at them for a moment. There was something specific in his expression as he looked at those handcuffs that Camille, watching from inside the car, recognized. It was the weight of a symbol, the thing those cuffs had meant in Greer's hands, and what it meant now that they were somewhere else. "Vance Harlan's," Greer, Maddox said, and his voice was very quiet, the kind of quiet that does not signal peace, but rather the absence of anything unnecessary. "You are under arrest for aggravated assault on a law enforcement officer." He took Greer's arm. He turned him with a firmness that was not rough, but was absolute. He pressed him gently against the hood of Greer's own cruiser, the car Greer had driven for 17 years, as though it were a throne, as though it gave him something that it had never actually had the power to be in, and he pressed Walt Greer's own handcuffs onto Walt Greer's own wrists. The click of the ratchet was very loud in the August stillness. Camille allowed herself her first full breath of the evening. She took her hands off the steering wheel slowly. She flexed her fingers. She looked at her hands for a moment, steady both of them, which was something she was quietly grateful for. And then she reached forward and lowered the volume on the car's audio system, leaving the line to Ray open, but bringing it to a background hum. Through the windshield in the red and blue light of the strobing cruiser, she could see Greer sitting in the back of Maddox's Tahoe. His face was turned toward the glass, toward some middle distance beyond it, toward nothing in particular. He was not looking at her. She was not sure he was looking at anything. Camille stepped out of the car for the first time since the stop had begun. The air was warm and thick and smelled of pine and clay and August. It smelled like home. She stood beside the rental car and breathed it in for one deliberate moment, and then she straightened her jacket and walked toward Sheriff Earl Maddox. On the southern horizon, the first hint of headlights, multiple moving fast in convoy, was beginning to appear. The FBI's arrival was not subtle and was not designed to be. 4 black Suburbans with federal plates and the kind of understated but unmissable professional gravity that comes with a full field office response materialized on State Road 9 within 40 minutes of Ray's call. They did not come with sirens, they came with speed and with lights and with the air of people who had somewhere to be and intended to be there now. They cordoned off both ends of the area around the rental car and Greer's cruiser with the efficient choreography of a team that had done this before. Forensic technicians began the process of documenting the scene with the kind of thoroughness that communicates without a word spoken. That every detail of what happened here is going to matter in a proceeding that is going to matter. Camille gave her initial statement to the first Atlanta field agent on scene, a woman named Diane Coulter, sharp and fast, who took notes with the efficiency of someone who understood that the window for capturing precise detail closes quickly. And then she sat in the back of one of the Suburbans with a cup of coffee that tasted nothing like her mother's and waited for SAC Ray. He arrived 45 minutes after the initial call. Leonard Ray in person was a different presence from Leonard Ray on the phone, which was itself a formidable presence. He was tall and spare, with close-cropped white hair, and the kind of unhurried measuring gaze that came from a lifetime of walking into rooms where the facts had not yet been established, and needing to establish them quickly. He shook Camille's hand once firmly, the way he shook everyone's hand, and looked at her with an attention that took inventory without being intrusive. "You good?" he said. "I'm good," she said. He nodded. He believed her because she did not do the thing people sometimes did when they said they were good and weren't. She did not add anything, did not qualify, did not reach for reassurance. She was good in the way a person is good when they have been through something difficult and have emerged from it with their faculties intact, which was a different kind of good from not having been through anything difficult at all. But it was real, and he could see it. They moved inside to the Caldwell County Sheriff's Building, where FBI technicians had already begun the process of turning a battered conference room into a functional command space. The contrast between the federal equipment being set up and the institutional furniture of the county building told its own story about the gap between these two worlds. Ray closed the door. He sat down across from Camille, and he looked at her with an expression that she had seen before, the look of someone who has information that is going to change the shape of a conversation. "I need to tell you something," he said, "that you didn't have context for when you were sitting on the side of that road." He opened his laptop. He turned it toward her. On the screen was the BAU file she had bookmarked 6 weeks ago and not finished reading, the Torah's analysis, the pattern recognition project, the civil rights complaint density mapping for 3 rural Alabama counties. He had pulled it up and scrolled it to the section she had not reached, Caldwell County, a table. Complaint numbers by deputy, cross-referenced with dispositions. The name W. Greer appeared 11 times over 4 years. 11 filed complaints: excessive force, unlawful search, deprivation of rights, coercion. None of the 11 had been forwarded to the Alabama Attorney General's office. None had reached the DOJ. All 11 had been processed through the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department's internal affairs process, which had found in all 11 cases insufficient evidence to substantiate the allegations. The head of Caldwell County's Internal Affairs Division was a Captain Roy Sutton, who had been with the department for 21 years and who was a groomsman at Walt Greer's wedding. Camille looked at this information for a long time without speaking. Ray let her. Torres flagged this county specifically, she said finally. He flagged it as a high-probability active predation corridor. He did, Ray said. State Road 9 was one of 3 stretches he identified as statistically anomalous in terms of out-of-county stop rates correlated with racial demographics of drivers and correlated with a specific pattern of outcomes, elevated rates of searches, elevated rates of reported property loss, nearly no subsequent prosecution that resulted in conviction. Camille was quiet again for a moment. Something was happening in her expression, not shock, because the evidence had been pointing at this with enough consistency that shock would have required her to have been ignoring the indicators, and she hadn't been ignoring them. She had simply not yet assembled them into this specific shape. What was happening was the particular internal experience of pieces arranging themselves into a pattern you had been working toward without knowing the final form. I wasn't randomly stopped, she said. No, Ray said. Greer's pattern is highly consistent. Out-of-state plates. State Road 9, specifically the stretch between mile markers 28 and 34. Thursday evenings through Saturday nights. The timing correlates with the reduced supervisory presence at the end of Maddox's shift rotation. You fit the profile of the drivers he targets, not you specifically, not because of anything about you personally, but because you were a woman driving alone in a rental car with out-of-state plates on a Thursday evening. Camille looked at the screen, at the map, at mile marker 31 where her rental car was still parked on the shoulder under floodlights while federal technicians photographed it. He was already on a federal list, she said. A preliminary analysis, not yet an open investigation, Ray said carefully. But yes, his name was in our system. What happened tonight converts that analysis from a background monitoring file into the foundation of a full federal investigation. What this meant, what the full weight of this revelation meant, was something that took a moment to land in its proper dimensions. She had not stumbled into this situation. She had not been unlucky, had not been in the wrong place, had not been a random target of a random bad actor on a random night. She had driven down a road that was already poisoned past a mile marker, that was already known and been stopped by a man who was already in a federal database and had not yet been stopped himself because the system designed to stee him had been occupied by the people he knew. She had been the person the trap caught that couldn't be swallowed. She thought about the 11 filed complaints. She thought about the 11 people who had gone through something in the vicinity of what she had just gone through on this same road in the preceding 4 years, and who had emerged from it with nothing but a dismissed complaint and whatever they had lost on the side of the road. She thought about what it had cost those 11 people to file those complaints in the first place, the specific courage that required, and what it had meant to have those complaints vanish into Captain Roy Sutton's desk. What do we have from his dashcam archive? She asked. Technicians pulled everything on scene, Ray said. We'll have preliminary review in a few hours. He paused. There's something else. Cody Pruitt, the rookie partner Coulter's team, has him in an interview room. He's been in there for 40 minutes, and he's giving nothing useful. He's scared, but he's giving canned answers. Camille set down her coffee. I'd like to talk to him. The interview room smelled like the interior of every county law enforcement building she had ever been, in a specific blend of institutional cleaner old carpet and something that was either mildew or the accumulated anxiety of 1,000 difficult conversations held in small spaces. 2 Atlanta field agents, Henderson and Marsh, had been working Cody Pruitt for the better part of an hour when Camille came in. Pruitt was young. She had registered that on the road, the baby-faced quality of him under the hat brim, the way he had moved, the specific uncertainty that had been visible even from 20 feet away when Greer was escalating. In person, in the interview room, he looked younger than 24. He had the face of someone who had grown up hearing that there was a right thing to do and who had been learning in increments that knowing the right thing and doing the right thing were 2 separate skills that required 2 separate forms of courage. He looked up when Camille came in. His eyes went to her, and something happened in them, a rapid, uncomfortable recognition. She was the agent Greer had pointed a gun at. She was the woman whose credentials he had stood 20 feet away from and watched be rejected. She was in the simplest possible terms, the person whose situation he could have changed by walking forward and saying something, and had not. She sat across from him. Henderson and Marsh were still in the room flanking the door. Camille folded her hands on the table and said nothing for approximately 10 minutes. It was not a manipulative silence exactly. It was simply the silence of a person who was not in a hurry and who was paying very close attention. She watched Pruitt the way she watched all subjects, not with the aggressive searching quality that people sometimes associated with interrogation, but with the steady receiving attention of someone who understood that most of what a person communicates, they communicate without knowing they're doing it. His hands moved, a specific pattern touching the edge of the table, then his own forearm, then back to the table that she recognized as the self-soothing behavior of someone whose nervous system was under sustained load. His eyes moved to the door once every 90 seconds or so, approximately, which was not the eye movement of someone looking for a physical exit, but the eye movement of someone for whom an exit from the situation they were in, some release from what they knew and were carrying, had become a pressing physical need. He was not scared of the FBI in the way a person who has done something truly criminal is scared of the FBI. He was scared of something more complicated than that. "Deputy Pruitt," she said finally. Her voice was quiet. No particular introduction, no setup. Just his name and the space after it. "I'm the agent Officer Greer pointed his weapon at tonight." Pruitt's jaw tightened. "I'm not an internal affairs investigator," she continued. "I'm a profiler. I study behavior, specifically why people make the choices they make under pressure, and what those choices tell us about the circumstances that enabled them." She let that sit for a moment. "And right now, your behavior is telling me something." He didn't say anything, but his hands had stopped moving. "You're not scared of us," she said. "You're scared of what we're going to find when we look at Greer's record. And you're scared because you've been present for some of it, and you said nothing, and you understand that there's a specific word for what a person who was present and said nothing is called when a federal grand jury convenes." Pruitt's composure cracked. Not dramatically, it was not a loud break, not a sudden collapse. It was the kind of crack that happens when the weight of something has been pressing long enough that the structure finally yields quietly in one place. His eyes went briefly to the table, and when they came back, they were different in a way she recognized. "I didn't." He started, stopped, started again. "He told me it was how things worked here, that you had to, that there were people in this county who needed to be kept in line, and that the law wasn't always the tool you used to do that." He said Greer's system in pieces, the way people describe things they have been carrying in a compressed form for too long. Quickly, unevenly, the words coming out in the specific order of what was most pressing, rather than what was most logical. The pattern of stops, out-of-state plates, Thursday through Saturday nights, the pretextual taillight claim, and then the detail that made Camille's jaw tighten involuntarily. The detail she controlled the reaction to, before it reached her face, the rubber mallet in Greer's kit bag for the nights when a taillight needed to become broken after the stop had already begun. The cash. The valuables that disappeared from glove compartments during searches. The specific way Greer would return to his patrol car between searches, and the specific way the second search would always find something the first had not. And then Cody Pruitt said the name Darnell Price. The name landed differently than the rest of it, not because it was louder or more dramatic. Pruitt said it almost quietly, the way you say a thing you have been not saying for long enough, that saying it out loud feels strange in your mouth, but because of what came after it, the specific details that accumulated around the name and gave it its weight. Darnell Price. 22 years old at the time of the stop 8 months ago. From Meridian, Mississippi. Driving a 2009 Chevy pickup. Mississippi plates heading south on State Road 9 toward a construction job in Georgia. A framing crew that had offered him a starting position 3 weeks before. He had a cooler in the truck bed with lunch from his mother's house. He had a playlist he was working through on the drive. He had, by every available account, nothing in his truck that was not exactly what it appeared to be. Greer stopped him at mile marker 31. Same stretch of road. Same pretextual claim, something about a swerving motion, not the taillight that time. He searched the truck, once found nothing. He was angry, Pruitt said. The kind of angry he got when the stop was not going the way he expected, When a person didn't have what he anticipated they would have when the pretextual search came up empty and he had invested time in it. He went back to his patrol car. Pruitt had stayed near the front of Darnell Price's truck exactly as Greer had trained him, to maintaining the driver's sightline, keeping him occupied, giving Greer the space to do what he needed to do. He had not fully understood what Greer was doing in the patrol car. He had told himself he didn't know. He admitted to Camille now, very specifically, not looking. Greer had returned to the truck for the second search. He found under the driver's seat a small bag of heroin. Darnell Price was arrested on the spot. He had no prior record. He was taken to the Caldwell County Jail, charged with possession, with intent to distribute a charge enhanced by the amount Greer claimed to have found, and assigned a court-appointed attorney who had 16 active cases and 37 minutes to spend with Darnell Price before the preliminary hearing. The attorney advised him to take a plea deal. The charges were serious. The evidence appeared solid, and a trial in Caldwell County, with a jury drawn from Caldwell County, was in the attorney's professional assessment not a favorable proposition for a young black man from Mississippi with no local connections. Darnell Price took the plea. He received a 4-year sentence in an Alabama state facility. He had been there for 8 months when this particular Thursday evening began. His engagement to be married had not survived the arrest. His construction job in Georgia had not held his position. His mother, a home health aide in Meridian, was driving 4 hours each way for monthly visits and had taken a second job to cover the costs. Camille wrote the name in her notebook and closed it. She looked at Pruitt, who was looking at the table. "Did you see him retrieve the bag from his own vehicle?" she asked. Pruitt was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't see him do it. I was at the front of Price's truck. But when we searched the truck the first time, I was thorough. I checked under both seats. There was nothing under the driver's seat the first time. And you said nothing." It was not a question. It was not an accusation exactly. It was simply a statement of what had happened, said in the level, non-judgmental voice she used when she was giving someone the space to respond to a fact honestly, rather than defensively. "No," Pruitt said. His voice was very small. "I said nothing." She stood. She picked up her notebook and her pen, and she looked at him for a long moment, not with contempt, because contempt was not useful here and was not what she felt, which was something more complicated and more exhausted than contempt. What she felt was the specific weight of understanding how something like Darnell Price happens, the precise mechanism of it, the way it requires not just a Walt Greer, but the accumulated silence of every Cody Pruitt who stood at the front of the truck and did not look. "Tell Agent Henderson everything she said, every stop you witnessed, every time you observed behavior that concerned you. Every name you remember. The only thing that helps you now is complete and immediate cooperation, and even then, the help is limited and the timeline is short." She walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame. "Darnell Price is 22 years old," she said, not turning around. "He is currently in a state prison in Alabama for a crime your partner committed. He went to a construction job in Georgia. He had a cooler with lunch from his mother's house in the truck bed." She left the room. The dashcam archive took 3 hours to process. FBI forensic technician Laura Stokes, 29, thorough, with the specific patience of someone who understood that what was on a recording was only as valuable as the integrity of the chain of evidence around it, worked through the files from Greer's cruiser with a methodical attention that did not allow for shortcuts. She logged every file, verified timestamps, checked for discontinuities in the recording that would indicate intentional erasure or manipulation. She found one. Greer's dashcam had been disabled, the video feed cut at a specific timestamp during the night of the Darnell Price stop. The disabling was consistent with a manual override from the cruiser's console, which required a deliberate action rather than a technical malfunction. But the dashcam's audio system, the microphone array that fed the recording, had not been cut at the same time. It was a model-specific quirk of the Caldwell County Fleet's patrol vehicles, a budget procurement from 7 years prior, that the department had never updated the audio and video feeds were on separate circuits, and the manual console override controlled only the video. The audio from Deputy Greer's dashcam during the night of the Darnell Price stop was intact. All of it. Stokes called Camille at 2:47 in the morning. Camille was in the conference room, which had been converted into a workspace, drinking her third cup of bad coffee and reading through the case history on Darnell Price's arrest and plea. The court documents, the arrest report in Greer's handwriting, the plea agreement with its careful anesthetic language that processed the destruction of a young man's plans into a series of legal clauses and disposition codes. She listened to the audio file on a set of headphones. She heard Greer's voice slightly muffled by the cruiser's cabin acoustics during the interval between the first search of Price's truck and the second. He was talking to himself the way people talk to themselves when they believe no one is listening, which is a different quality entirely from the way they talk when they know a record is being made. There was a specific sound, a glove compartment being opened, the particular plastic and mechanism sound of it, different from the sound of the vehicle's main storage systems. Then a rustle. Then the glove compartment closing. Then Walt Greer, in the voice he used when he was alone and satisfied, said, "Let's see what kind of memory this kid takes back to Mississippi." It was 22 words. The audio quality was not perfect, but it was comprehensible. It was comprehensible enough to be played in a federal courtroom. It was comprehensible enough for 12 jurors to hear Walt Greer's voice in the act of what he was doing and know without any uncertainty what they were hearing. Camille pulled off the headphones and sat very still for a moment. Then she called Ray. "We have him," she said. By morning, the case against Walt Greer was no longer a single incident of assault on a federal officer. It was a federal civil rights investigation with audio evidence of evidence tampering, a corroborating witness in Cody Pruitt, 11 prior complaints, 3 of which Pruitt's account now connected to specific incidents he had directly observed, and a wrongfully imprisoned man in an Alabama state facility whose case file now had an FBI case number attached to it. 2 additional Caldwell County deputies served with immunity agreements and confronted with Pruitt's testimony, and the audio file came forward within 24 hours. They described Walt Greer in terms that were consistent with everything else a man the department organized itself around, not because anyone admired what he did, but because everyone understood the cost of challenging it. Captain Roy Sutton was named explicitly in both deputies' accounts as the mechanism by which complaints vanished and investigations failed to materialize. Sutton had not merely failed to act, he had actively worked to ensure that the complaints against Greer never reached anyone with the authority to act on them. Sutton was placed under federal investigation by Thursday morning. The Caldwell County Sheriff's Department, as it had existed for the past 17 years, had begun the process of coming apart. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Alabama filed the indictments on a Monday morning, 4 weeks after the stop on State Road 9. The charges against Deputy Walt Greer were specific and numerous. Assault on a federal officer in violation of Title 18, Section 111, deprivation of rights under color of law in the matter of Dr. Camille Okafor, evidence tampering in the case of Darnell Price, perjury before the Caldwell County Circuit Court in the proceedings against Price. Civil rights violations under Title 18, Section 242, across the Price matter, and 3 additional incidents corroborated by the testimonies of Pruitt and the 2 cooperating deputies. The charge sheet for Captain Roy Sutton was shorter, but no less serious obstruction of justice conspiracy to deprive civil rights and accessory to evidence tampering. His immunity deal had not materialized. He had been too slow to cooperate and too late to offer anything the FBI did not already have from other sources. The morning the indictments were filed, Camille drove to her mother's house in Grayford. She did not call ahead. She pulled into Ruth Okafor's driveway at 9:15 in the morning, parked the rental car, a different one. A dark gray Camry from a different rental company out of Birmingham, obtained through bureau channels this time, and sat in the driveway for a moment before getting out. The house was exactly as it had always been. A craftsman bungalow painted pale yellow with a front porch that her father had rebuilt when Camille was 11 and which had survived 3 decades without needing further attention. The garden had been her mother's project for 40 years and showed it was overplanted and abundant and completely itself the way things are when someone has cared for them for a long time without any particular audience in mind. Ruth Okafor appeared at the screen door before Camille had made it to the porch steps. She was smaller than she used to be, not recently. But over the accumulated years, the way people become smaller, as their bodies gradually revise their ambitions in the direction of sustainability. She was wearing a house dress and slippers, and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she looked at her daughter coming up the porch steps with the specific expression that Ruth had always used for things that mattered, an intensity of attention that was warmer than most people's open affection. "Come sit," she said. Not a question. They sat on the porch in two of the old metal chairs that had been on this porch since before Camille could remember, and Ruth poured sweet tea from a pitcher she had already prepared, which meant she had been expecting company, which meant Ray had called ahead, which Camille had not asked him to do, but was retroactively grateful for. Ruth listened to the essential shape of what had happened. Camille kept it measured factual, the version without the internal experience, the version she would give to a colleague. And when Camille was done, Ruth was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden. "They picked the wrong woman," Ruth said. It was not delivered as a comfort. It was a statement of fact in the tone Ruth had always used for facts, which was a tone that did not particularly require agreement, because facts did not require agreement. They simply were. "I was just driving home," Camille said. "I know that," Ruth said. "That's what I mean." She reached over and put her hand on Camille's briefly, and without ceremony, and then she withdrew it, and they sat on the porch for a while and drank sweet tea and watched the light move through the garden. And Camille felt slowly, and with the particular grace of familiar things, something in her chest begin to settle. She stayed for 3 days. She helped her mother with physical therapy exercises and grocery shopping, and the pecan pie that Ruth had been planning since before the surgery. She slept in her childhood bedroom with the window open and the cricket sound coming in, and she woke up each morning knowing that Darnell Price was still in a state prison in Alabama, and that there was a trial coming, and that she had work to do when it arrived. Greer's defense attorney, a Birmingham man named Chet Alderman, with a polished professional manner and a client list that leaned heavily toward people who needed the law, explained to them in ways that temporarily made it seem more flexible than it was, announced his strategy to the press in the kind of careful, calibrated language that told Camille everything she needed to know about it. He would argue context. He would argue professional discretion under stress. He would question the narrative. He would, in other words, argue everything except the evidence, because the evidence was not arguable. She returned to Quantico for 2 weeks. She added the Caldwell County case architecture to the BAU's monitoring infrastructure, ensured the pattern analysis that Torres had begun was expanded into a full formal assessment, and handled the outstanding elements of her other caseload. Then she flew back to Alabama for the trial. The emergency motion for Darnell Price's release had been filed and granted within 10 days of the indictment. A federal judge had reviewed the audio evidence from Greer's dashcam Pruitt's testimony and the forensic analysis establishing that the contents of Price's glove compartment had been emptied during the first search and occupied during the second, and had issued a stay of his sentence pending a formal review. Darnell Price walked out of the state correctional facility on a Tuesday morning in September. He walked out with a garbage bag containing the possessions he had brought in with him, a Bible, a photograph of his parents taken at their 30th anniversary, a change of clothes that no longer fit him correctly, because he had lost weight in ways that the institutional food did not account for. He met Camille for the first time in a small conference room at the federal courthouse in Birmingham the morning before his testimony before the grand jury. He was accompanied by his parents, his father Maurice, a maintenance supervisor for the Meridian School District, and his mother Dolores, the home health aide who had been making the 4-hour drive every month for 8 months, and by an attorney provided through a civil rights legal organization that the FBI had connected his family with. Camille shook his hand. He was 22 years old, and he looked like someone who had spent 8 months in a place that was not designed for the preservation of 22-year-olds. He was thin across the face and cautious in his movements, the specific caution of someone who had learned to read environments carefully because the cost of misreading them had proven real and high. His eyes were tired in the particular way that a different kind of tiredness than the one that comes from insufficient sleep, the kind that comes from having been required over an extended period to maintain vigilance in a hostile place. He looked at Camille with an expression that she found difficult to categorize, but which she understood as she was the agent. The person this had happened to. The person whose being stopped had resulted in his being released. "I appreciate what you did," he said. His voice was quieter than she expected, measured. "You didn't need my help to deserve what's happening," she said. "This was always going to be where this ended. You got there faster because of what happened to me, and I'm sorry it took 8 months, but it was always going to arrive here." She meant it exactly as she said it. She was not performing reassurance she did not do, that had never found it useful. She was simply telling him what was true. Greer's pattern was documented. Pruitt's conscience was already under load before she arrived on State Road 9. The Torres analysis had already flagged the corridor. Something was going to surface eventually. What she had done was accelerate the arrival of an outcome that had been building in the background all along. He nodded slowly. She could not tell whether he found that comforting. His testimony before the grand jury was given in the specific register that she had learned to associate with people who have spent a long time holding something carefully and are now finally in a context where they are permitted to put it down. He was not dramatic. He did not perform. He sat in the witness chair and he answered the questions directly, and he described what had happened on the night of the stop with the specific precision of someone who has replayed an event so many times in so many quiet moments that its details have become fixed and permanent. He described the first search, the nothingness under the seat, the interval when Greer returned to his cruiser, the second search, the moment the bag appeared in a space where 9 minutes earlier he had been absolutely certain there was no bag. The expression on Greer's face when he held it up, a satisfaction so specific and so directed that Darnell had understood in that instant that this had been the plan from the beginning, and that the plan had not required anything of Darnell except his presence and his vulnerability. He described the plea, the attorney with 16 cases and 37 minutes, the calculation that a trial in Caldwell County was not a favorable proposition for someone who looked like him. The moment he signed the agreement, which was the moment he had been required to formally confirm a lie about himself, to consent in writing to the version of him that Walt Greer had constructed in order to limit the damage. "He decided to ruin my life," Darnell said toward the end. His voice was steady. "Not because I'd done anything, because I was there. Because I was the kind of person he'd decided he could do it to." When the U.S. attorney played the dashcam audio, Greer's voice, the glove compartment, opening the rustle, the satisfied declaration about what kind of memory Darnell would take back to Mississippi. Darnell closed his eyes. He kept them closed for approximately 10 seconds. Then he opened them and looked straight ahead. The grand jury returned a true bill on all counts. They took less than 2 hours. The trial of the United States versus Walter Greer opened in the federal courthouse in Birmingham on a Monday morning in November, and it was from its first day the kind of proceeding that the press covers, not because it is legally complex, but because it is morally clear, the kind of clarity that makes for a story that people want to follow because they want to see where it lands. The gallery was full. It had been full every day of the preliminary hearings as well, but it was differently full now, the specific fullness of a room in which something is expected to be concluded, in which the accumulated weight of everything that has been building is about to find its proper resolution. There were reporters. There were community members from Caldwell County and from Birmingham, including a contingent of people who had driven from Meridian, Mississippi, Darnell Price's community, and who occupied 3 rows of the gallery in quiet collective attendance. Chet Alderman Greer's attorney was professionally polished and evidentially empty, which is the most dangerous kind of attorney to be in a federal courtroom, because the emptiness requires concealment, and concealment requires performance. His opening statement was full of the language of context, the pressures of rural law enforcement, the split-second decisions that officers must make, the complex and sometimes ambiguous nature of roadside encounters. It was language designed to occupy space rather than communicate substance, to give the jury permission to find reasonable doubt in the fog of professional complexity. The assistant U.S. attorney, a woman named Patricia Nance, had no patience for fog. Her opening statement was 47 minutes of evidence delivered in the precise, unhurried voice of someone who knew that clarity was the most devastating thing she could offer the jury. She played the dashcam audio in the courtroom during the opening. She read Pruitt's account. She quoted the 11 complaints buried by Sutton. She put Greer's face on the screen, the name tag, the badge number, the record. and she connected every piece of evidence to every other piece with the steady sequential logic of a case that had been built rather than assembled. When Camille took the stand on the third day of testimony, the courtroom was very quiet. She wore a simple navy suit, no bureau badge, no visible credentials. She was a witness today, not an agent, and the distinction mattered to her. She had testified in federal proceedings many times before, but the specific quality of this testimony was different. She was testifying about something that had happened to her personally, which was a different kind of testimony from the expert witnessing she had done before, and which required her to be present in the account rather than above it. She was not above it, but she was in control of how present she allowed herself to be. Patricia Nance walked her through the evening, sequentially beginning with the drive from Birmingham and ending with Ray's voice through the car speakers. Camille's testimony was clinical in its precision and completely without dramatization, which was paradoxically more powerful than drama would have been. She described each of Greer's actions, each of his statements, each decision point, where he had had an opportunity to choose differently and had not chosen differently. And she described them in the specific observational language of a behavioral analyst who was also a participant, which gave her account a layered quality that was both personally authentic and professionally exact. She described the laugh, the specific quality of it, the specific meaning it had communicated. She described the word sweetheart and what it had been designed to do. She described the moment the gun came out. She described the button she pressed, the call she made, and the sound of Walt Greer's voice after SAC Ray spoke through the car's speakers, the specific sound of a man's structural confidence collapsing. She described all of this without raising her voice, without performing distress, without asking the jury for anything except their attention. The cross-examination was Chet Alderman's last viable option, and everyone in the courtroom understood it, including Alderman, which was why he approached it with the performance of a man who had convinced himself that there was something useful left to find. He opened with her profession, her expertise, her reputation as a behavioral analyst, a profiler, a woman who had spent 11 years in the behavioral analysis unit studying the psychology of dangerous people. It was meant to function as a double-edged credential. Here is someone who should have known how to de-escalate, who should have understood the dynamics of a roadside encounter, who perhaps Alderman's ultimate insinuation used her professional knowledge not to calm the situation, but to engineer a particular outcome. Dr. Okafor, he began, and his voice carried the practiced warmth of a man who is about to be the opposite of warm. You're an expert in behavior. You study people for a living. Correct, you profile them. I analyze behavior to assist in criminal investigations, Camille said. The word profile has specific technical meaning in my field, but yes. And you were doing that, analyzing Deputy Greer's behavior from the moment he approached your vehicle. I was observing his behavior, she said. Yes, as my training dictates in any law enforcement encounter. Alderman moved along the railing with the studied, relaxed quality of a man who was building towards something. And what did your expert analysis tell you? Dr. Okafor, was Deputy Greer dangerous? Was he the kind of officer who, in your expert professional opinion, posed a serious threat? My analysis told me several things, Camille said. It told me his baseline behavior was unusually aggressive for a routine traffic stop. It told me his questioning pattern was designed to establish dominance rather than gather information. His body language, specifically his proximity to me, and his deliberate choice of the passenger-side approach, was the body language of someone establishing a physical power dynamic before any verbal exchange occurred. His failure to answer direct questions about the basis for the stop, combined with his refusal to identify a clear legal justification for the exit order, were consistent with someone operating on the assumption that they would not be required to justify their actions. A murmur moved through the gallery. Alderman adjusted his approach. A 15-year veteran deputy, he said with a record of service to his community. Are you suggesting he's some kind of monster? Camille looked at him steadily. The word monster is a creation of fiction. Mr. Alderman, she said, in my professional work, we deal with men who make choices. Deputy Greer chose to conduct a stop with no legitimate basis. He chose to escalate the situation when I asserted my legal rights. He chose to draw his weapon on an unarmed woman in a locked vehicle. And he chose to laugh when presented with my federal credentials. She paused. A single deliberate pause. Those are the choices of a man who believed he was above accountability, not a man who was doing his job. The murmur in the gallery moved again. Alderman rattled, but not finished, tried a different angle. You refused to comply with a lawful order to exit the vehicle. Correct. Isn't it possible that your defiance, your refusal, was the cause of this whole situation? Camille turned her gaze to the jury. Not to Alderman. To the jury. It was not a lawful order, she said, and her voice was the voice she used in briefing rooms when she needed a point to settle and stay settled. An officer requires probable cause to order a driver out of a vehicle for a simple traffic violation. Deputy Greer had none. What I did was decline to surrender my Fourth Amendment rights, the same rights every person in this country is guaranteed. The same rights Deputy Greer swore an oath to protect. A beat. You asked whether my refusal caused this situation. With respect, Mr. Alderman, that question assumes that my constitutional rights are a provocation. Alderman stalked back along the railing. He was losing the thread, and he knew it. He tried in the way of a man who has run out of legitimate options, the final move, the one he had been holding back because he understood how dangerous it was. Since you raised your professional expertise, Dr. Okafor, since you are, as you've told us, trained to profile people to understand their psychology, let's discuss the psychology of my client. Camille's expression did not change, but something in her eyes did, a quality of attention that those who knew her well would have recognized as the specific engagement of a woman who had been given exactly what she needed. I'd welcome that, she said. Alderman froze for a fraction of a second. He had expected deflection or a legal objection from the prosecution, or at minimum, an expression of reluctance. He had not expected the answer she gave, and the absence of deflection destabilized him in a way that was visible to anyone paying attention. Deputy Greer, Camille said, speaking with the same measured informational quality she brought to everything, displays indicators that I have encountered across a specific category of behavioral subject in my work. He targets individuals he perceives as occupying a lower position in a social hierarchy. He has constructed not because those individuals present legitimate threats, but because the act of assertion over them produces a psychological reward, a temporary resolution of an insecurity that his sense of self-worth is built around. His laugh when he saw my credentials was not the laugh of genuine disbelief. A genuinely disbelieving person questions. They investigate. They verify. He did none of those things. His laugh was the laugh of rejection, a psychological defense mechanism deployed because the alternative, accepting what the badge actually meant, would have required him to revise a fundamental assumption about who has authority and what forms it takes. His worldview, specifically his worldview about the relationship between race and authority, was so thoroughly established that it functioned as a kind of structural blindness. He could not see me as what I was not, because he lacked the intelligence to process the evidence, but because processing it would have cost him something he was not willing to pay. The courtroom was completely silent. Alderman stood at the railing with his mouth slightly open. He was a skilled attorney, and he had been in a great many difficult positions in courtrooms, but he was in one now that he had created for himself, and the specific nature of it, the experience of having aimed someone's expertise at them and had it return in a direction he had not anticipated, was one he was not recovering from in front of a jury. No further questions, he said. He returned to his table. He sat down. He did not look at Greer. Camille stepped down from the stand. She walked back to her seat in the gallery, and she sat down, and she was very still and very quiet. And she thought about a young man named Darnell Price, who was somewhere in this building today, waiting, and about a woman named Ruth Okafor, who was in a craftsman bungalow in Grayford, tending her garden, and about 11 people who had filed 11 complaints on 11 separate occasions and watched each complaint disappear into Captain Roy Sutton's desk. She thought about all of these things, and she sat with them, and she waited for the jury to come back. The jury deliberated for 93 minutes. In Camille's experience, and she had considerable experience as an expert witness in proceedings where verdicts were not foregone conclusions, this was not the deliberation time of uncertainty. It was not the time of a jury working to resolve competing versions of events. It was the time of a jury that had arrived at a conclusion early in their deliberation and had spent the remaining portion ensuring that the paperwork was correct and the formality of the process had been honored because they understood that the formality of the process was part of what made the outcome meaningful. When the knock came at the jury room door and the bailiff moved to open it, the courtroom made the specific collective adjustment that happens when an assembled group of people understands that something is about to become permanent. The gallery straightened. The press pool stopped its movement. Even the ambient sound of the building, the ventilation system, the distant sound of other proceedings in other rooms seemed to recede. The 12 jurors filed in and took their seats. Not a single one of them looked at Walt Greer. In Camille's experience, this was almost universally ominous for a defendant. Juries that have acquitted tend to look at defendants upon their return, sometimes with relief, sometimes with apology, sometimes with something that wants to communicate that they tried to help. Juries that have convicted tend not to look because the looking feels like a cruelty. They want to spare themselves even when the verdict does not spare the defendant. Greer, seated at the defense table in a suit that fit him poorly, and which he had been wearing in some form for 4 days, looked at the jury with the specific, desperate attention of a man who has been telling himself a story about how this ends and is no longer certain the story is true. His face had changed significantly over the course of the trial. The color had not returned. The confidence had not returned. What remained was the face of someone who had been held in a reality for 3 weeks that differed substantially from the reality he had inhabited for the preceding 17 years and who had not yet found a way to reconcile the two. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Eleanor Brandt asked. She was 61 years old, had been on the federal bench for 14 years, and had a reputation in the Northern District for being, as one attorney had described her, surgically fair and completely without mercy when the facts are clear. Her voice carried the specific authority of someone for whom the formality of the proceeding was not theater, but substance, the form through which the content of the law expressed itself. We have, Your Honor. The jury foreman was a man named Gerald Oakes, a retired high school shop teacher from Hoover who had served on 2 prior juries and who had, Camille noted, maintained throughout the trial the careful, attentive expression of someone who understood that what he was doing mattered. He held the verdict form. He looked at it once. Then he looked at the courtroom. On the charge of assault on a federal officer in violation of Title 18, Section 111, Oakes said, and his voice was steady, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Walter Harlan Greer, guilty." The sound that came from Greer was involuntary and barely audible, a short, compressed exhalation, the sound of something leaving a body that had been holding it under pressure. His attorney placed a hand on his arm. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law in the matter of Dr. Camille Okafor, Oakes continued, "We find the defendant guilty." In the gallery, Maurice Price Darnell's father had his head bowed. His wife Dolores had her hand in his. On the charge of evidence tampering in the matter of Darnell Andre Price, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of perjury before the Caldwell County Circuit Court in the proceedings against Darnell Andre Price, we find the defendant guilty. Oakes went through all 16 counts. The word came back each time with the same steady quality repeated until it was no longer a word but a verdict. Until it was no longer a verdict but a fact. Until it was no longer a fact but a reckoning that had been building for 17 years on the side of dark Alabama roads and which had arrived here in this room with this finality because a woman had pressed a button on a steering column and refused to perform the fear that Walt Greer needed her to perform. On the 16th count, the word came back for the 16th time, and Walt Greer buried his face in his hands. Chet Alderman stared at the table. The sound from the gallery was not cheering. It was a collective released breath, the sound of a room of people exhaling something that had been held for a long time. Captain Roy Sutton had entered a plea agreement 3 days into the trial when it became clear that the testimony emerging from the trial rendered his trial a formality. He was cooperating fully. He would face sentencing separately. The blue wall of the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department had not merely failed, it had been dismantled piece by the accumulated weight of the things it had tried to bury. At the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, Judge Brandt gave the victims the opportunity to address the court before the formal proceeding. Darnell Price rose from the gallery and walked to the podium at a pace that was not slow, but was deliberate, the pace of someone who has thought carefully about this walk and who has decided that it will be taken at the pace that belongs to him, not the pace that someone else's urgency requires. He was wearing a suit that fit him now, purchased by his parents from a department store in Meridian 2 days before the hearing. He had put on some of the weight he had lost. His eyes were not the same eyes he had arrived at the courthouse with 8 months ago. They were not undamaged because the damage had been real, and the recovery from real damage is not a thing that completes itself quickly. But they carried something different than they had before. A harder, clearer quality. The eyes of someone who has paid a price they did not owe and who has come out at the other side of the payment, knowing precisely what they paid it for. He unfolded a single sheet of paper. His handwriting, large and careful, filled one side of it. "Mr. Greer," he began, and he addressed the man directly looking at the defense table, where Greer sat in a different suit than the one he had worn throughout the trial. This one provided by a county facility because the facility had Greer now. His hands were folded on the table in the specific way of hands that are newly conscious of their own stillness, accustomed to being in motion with authority, and now required to simply rest. "When you stopped me on State Road 9, I was 22 years old. I was driving to a construction job in Macon, Georgia. I had a playlist. I had lunch from my mother's house in the back. I had a plan." He paused, not for effect to breathe, because what came next was not easy, and he was allowing himself the time to say it correctly. "You took the plan. You took my job. You took my engagement." He glanced up from the paper. "My fiancée left 6 weeks after I went inside. She didn't know what else to do. I don't blame her." He returned to the paper. "You made my mother drive 8 hours round trip once a month for 8 months to see me in a place I should never have been. You made my father a man who has worked for this country his whole life, who has believed in this country's systems his whole life, spend 8 months explaining to himself how something like this could happen and not be fixed. You used his faith in the system as a weapon against him because you knew he'd taught me that the system was something to trust, and you knew that meant I'd trust the wrong part of it." He set the paper down. He didn't need it anymore. "You thought I was nobody," he said. The gallery was completely still. "You thought I was the kind of person things could happen to without consequence. You were wrong about that. Not because of anything special about me, just because every person you stopped on that road was somebody to someone. But you couldn't see that because you didn't need to. Nobody was making you see it." He straightened. "Today, this court is making you see it. I'm standing here in my freedom, Mr. Greer, watching you go where you put me. That's not revenge. That's just where the truth goes when it finally gets a clear path." He folded the paper. He walked back to his seat. His father put an arm around his shoulders, and his mother took his hand, and the three of them sat together in the gallery, in a silence that was not empty, but was full of everything that the preceding 8 months had cost them, and everything that this moment, inadequate as all moments of legal reckoning are in relation to what they are trying to address, was returning to them. Camille, sitting 3 rows back, did not speak. When Patricia Nance approached her before the formal sentencing and asked whether she wished to give a victim impact statement, Camille looked at Darnell Price for a moment, at the back of his head, at the set of his shoulders, at the way his father's arms stayed around him, and she shook her head. "Everything that needs to be said has been said," she told Nance. Judge Eleanor Brandt looked at Walt Greer for a long time before she spoke. He was standing. His attorney was beside him. He was in the facility suit, a muted gray that did not belong to him, that had belonged to a long series of other men before him, and would belong to a long series of others after. And he was standing with the specific posture of someone who has been told by their attorney to stand straight, and who is doing so because they have no other instructions to follow. "Mr. Greer," Judge Brandt said. She had a way of speaking and sentencing that Camille had read about in legal coverage of her prior proceedings, and which she now heard directly, unhurried, without performance, without the rhetorical flourish of someone who wanted their words to be quoted. Just the words given their correct weight, and then silence. "In 30 years on this bench," she said, "I have sentenced a great many people for a great many things. And one of the things I have learned in 30 years is that the crimes that cause me the most difficulty are not the most violent and not the most financially devastating, but the crimes that abuse trust. Because trust is the scaffolding on which everything else is built. When the scaffolding is corrupted, the things built on it are corrupted too, and they fall. And the falling does damage to people who never consented to be anywhere near the structure. She looked at the papers in front of her, then back at Greer. "You were given a badge," she said. "Not a title, not a rank. A badge, a symbol of a specific relationship between a person and the community they serve. You were told what that badge meant. You took an oath about what it meant. And then you spent 17 years using it as a private instrument of power over people who had done nothing to earn your attention, except exist in a way that your prejudice had already categorized as a problem." She glanced toward Darnell Price in the gallery. A brief acknowledging glance. What you did to Darnell Price, to a young man driving to a job with a cooler from his mother's house in his truck bed, was not a mistake. It was not a lapse in judgment. It was a choice made in the specific way you had made it dozens of times before, with the specific expectation that the system around you would cover the tracks. The fact that the system failed to cover those tracks this time because of the remarkable circumstances of who you chose to target on the night of August 19th does not change what you chose to do. It only changed whether anyone found out. She was quiet for a moment. The courtroom was very still. "On the count of assault on a federal officer," she said, "I sentence you to 22 years in federal custody. On the multiple counts of deprivation of civil rights across the matters of Dr. Okafor and Darnell Price, and the 3 additional incidents corroborated by witness testimony, I sentence you to 10 years on each count to be served concurrently with the 22-year sentence. On the counts of evidence tampering, perjury, and malicious prosecution in the matter of Darnell Price, I sentence you to an additional 18 years in federal custody." She looked at Greer over the edge of her reading glasses. "This second sentence is to be served consecutively." A tremor went through the courtroom. Consecutively. 40 years. Walter Harlan Greer was 48 years old. The mathematics required no elaboration. Aldermen began to rise. Judge Brandt held up a single hand. "I am not finished," she said, and Alderman sat back down. "Mr. Greer, you put an innocent man in a cage using the authority this court system entrusted to you. You used a bag of drugs from your own glove compartment and the indifference of a corrupt internal affairs process to make that cage permanent, or as permanent as you could make it. It is the judgment of this court that you will spend the remainder of your productive life in a cage of your own making, and that this will not be enough to account for what you took from Darnell Price and his family and the 11 other people whose complaints were buried. But it is what this court has power to give them. It is the fullest measure of the law directed at you." She placed her pen on the desk. "Remove him from my courtroom." The U.S. Marshals moved from their positions near the wall. They were efficient, and they were not rough because they were professionals, and the situation had nothing left in it that required force. They approached Greer, and they placed him in the restraints, the chains around his wrists, the chain at his waist, the shackles at his ankles, that the federal system used for transport. The sound of the ratchets and the chain links was specific and metallic, and in the complete silence of the courtroom, it was the only sound there was. They turned him. They walked him toward the door at the side of the courtroom, the door that opened to the holding corridor, the transport vehicles, the federal facility where he would begin the process of understanding what 40 years meant in the specific physical terms of days and weeks and months inside a concrete structure. The path from the defense table to the door took him past the gallery, past the seats where the community members from Caldwell County and Birmingham and Meridian, Mississippi had been sitting throughout the trial, past the rows where reporters had been taking notes, past the row where Maurice and Dolores Price, their son, and past the row where Camille was standing. She had risen from her seat quietly as the marshals began moving Greer toward the door. She was standing in the aisle, not blocking the path, but present within it, close enough that as the marshals walked Greer past, he passed within 3 feet of her. She did not move toward him. She did not speak. She did not reach for anything or gesture in any direction. She simply stood and looked at him with the same calm level, absolutely unafraid gaze she had held through the car window on State Road 9 in the dark with his gun pointed at her face. The same gaze that had enraged him on the highway because it had refused to perform what he needed it to perform. Greer looked at the floor. He looked at the chains on his wrists. He looked at the door ahead of him. He did not look at her. He did not need to. She was there, and he knew she was there. And what that knowledge felt like in his body, in whatever part of him was still processing experience with any accuracy, was something between them that required no further language. The man who had laughed at a gold shield on a dark Alabama highway was now wearing a number. He was walking in the same configuration wrists, restrained the specific mechanical sound of restraint that he had put on Darnell Price 8 months ago on a stretch of road that he had treated for 17 years as his personal instrument. The door closed behind him. The sound of it was quiet, final, and had no echo. The work that followed a verdict like this was not cinematic. It was administrative and procedural and slow unfolding across months in the language of motions, filed investigations, opened personnel actions taken, and policy revisions drafted by people who were not at the center of the story, but who were the mechanism through which the story became something more than a verdict. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division opened a formal investigation into the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department within 30 days of the verdict. The investigation was broad and methodical, and took as its mandate not just the specific acts committed by Walt Greer and covered by Roy Sutton, but the conditions, the hiring practices, the supervisory culture, the complaint intake and disposition processes that had allowed those acts to occur across an extended period without intervention. 3 additional deputies were terminated. Sutton, having cooperated in exchange for a reduced sentence, received 8 years a sentence. Judge Brandt described at his proceeding as the minimum that the facts of your complicity allow this court to impose with a clear conscience. He accepted it without speaking. Sheriff Earl Maddox announced his resignation at a press conference that was by every available account one of the more difficult things a person had publicly endured in the state of Alabama in some time. He apologized to Camille. He apologized to Darnell Price and his family. He apologized to the 11 people who had filed complaints that his department had failed to act on. His voice broke twice during the statement. He did not offer explanations for the inaction because he understood, and his public understanding of this was, Camille thought, the most genuinely honorable thing Earl Maddox had done in his career, that the specific failure he was responsible for did not benefit from explanation. It benefited from acknowledgement and from consequences, and he gave what he had to give of both. Darnell Price's wrongful conviction was formally vacated 3 months after the trial. The state of Alabama, in a proceeding that moved with more speed than such proceedings typically move, acknowledged the full circumstances of his case and issued a formal exoneration. A civil settlement was reached, the specifics of which were not disclosed publicly, but which Darnell's attorney described as adequate to the damage in a statement to the press that was characteristically understated for what Camille understood it actually represented. Darnell Price used a portion of the settlement to enroll in a construction management certification program in Meridian. He was accepted 2 weeks after the exoneration. His father accompanied him to the first day of class, not because Darnell needed the accompaniment, but because Maurice Price had spent 8 months waiting for the world to correct an injustice and wanted to be physically present at the moment when something like a future resumed. The construction crew in Georgia, learning of the exoneration, reached out through Darnell's attorney. The position was no longer available. The project had long since moved on, but the owner of the company offered a reference letter for any future application. Darnell did not require it for the certification program. He kept the letter anyway. He kept it in the same drawer as the photograph of his parents from their 30th anniversary. Camille returned to Quantico. The BAU file on Alabama's rural civil rights complaint corridor was formally escalated from a background monitoring document to an active federal assessment with Torres as the lead analyst. The patterns he had mapped and the specific mechanism by which Caldwell County had confirmed the validity of the assessment became part of a training module used in federal civil rights enforcement. The training module did not name Camille or Greer. It used the case as an anonymous case study. but the people who worked through it understood what they were looking at. She added the completed case to her personnel file without particular ceremony. It was the case file of a thing that had happened to her, and also the case file of a thing she had helped build into something that mattered beyond the thing that had happened to her, which was the outcome she had been working toward from the moment she pressed the button on the steering column. 3 weeks after the sentencing, on a Thursday evening in the first week of December, Camille drove south on State Road 9. She was in a rental car, a gray Camry Bureau arranged from a different agency than the one that had rented her the Fusion in August. The evening light was different from the August evening, shorter, cooler, the pines holding their color differently. The sky above them a clear and specific winter blue that was its own kind of beauty. The heat was gone. The air through the slightly lowered window was clean and cold and smelled of pine and dry clay. The winter version of the smell she had grown up with, the version that meant something different seasonally but carried the same essential character. She drove past mile marker 26, past the curve she had known since she was 9 years old, past the old feed store, past the places that were landmarks because she had passed them enough times over a lifetime to give them weight and permanence in her memory. She passed mile marker 31 without slowing. She did not look at the shoulder. She did not look at the gravel where the rental car had sat, or at the pines that had framed the flashlight beam, or at the stretch of road that had been, for a period of some months, a place with a very specific meaning attached to it. She looked at the road ahead. The road ahead was simply a road. She pulled into Ruth Okafor's driveway at 6:47 in the evening. The porch light was on. Through the front window, a warm yellow light was coming from the kitchen. She could smell, even before she opened the car door, the particular smell of something baking that her mother did with pecans and brown sugar, and a specific patience that could not be replicated by any recipe written down. It had to be learned by being present in the kitchen while it happened. And Camille had been present in that kitchen for enough years that the smell was stored somewhere in her body, alongside the sound of Ruth's voice and the texture of the old metal chairs on the porch and everything else that belonged to the part of her life that predated FBI badges and federal courtrooms and dark Alabama roads. She turned off the engine. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the car and the cooling engine tick and the winter evening silence of this particular driveway, in this particular place, and she allowed herself to be aware of what had passed between the last time she had made this drive and this time. Then she got out of the car. Ruth Okafor opened the screen door before Camille had made it halfway up the porch steps. She was wearing her house dress and her slippers and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead exactly as she had been in September, and she looked at her daughter coming up the steps with the same intensity of attention that had always been Ruth's way of expressing what other people expressed with more words. She did not say anything for a moment. She simply looked. Then she held the door open and said, "Pie's warm." Camille stepped into the house. The kitchen was lit warmly, and the smell of the pie was even stronger inside, and on the counter there were 2 plates and 2 forks already set out, and the gospel station from Grayford was playing low on the radio that her mother kept on the windowsill above the sink, and the house smelled like all the Decembers Camille had ever spent in it. She sat down at the kitchen table, the same chairs, the same light falling from the same fixture, and she took her shoes off because she was home, and because her feet were tired in a way that had been accumulating for months. Her mother set a slice of pie in front of her without asking whether she wanted it, because the question would have been unnecessary, and sat down across from her with a cup of tea. Through the kitchen window, the Alabama winter night was still and quiet and full of pines standing in the dark with their particular patience, the patience of things that have been where they are for a long time and intend to remain. The road behind the house was dark. The road in front of it was dark. The road where this had all begun was dark. Camille Okafor ate her mother's pecan pie in the warm kitchen light, and for the first time in months, she was simply a daughter home. Walt Greer thought a badge made him untouchable. He did not understand that he had spent 17 years building a case against himself, and all it took was one woman who refused to be afraid of him. Justice does not always announce itself. Sometimes it presses a button on a steering wheel and the rest takes care of itself. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel for more stories of accountability, resilience, and the people who refused to be silenced. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and hit the notification bell so you never miss what's coming next.